So today you want to talk to us about measuring the value of DevOps. So real simple, how do we measure the value in DevOps?
Well, it's hard, right? This is one of the trickiest questions. I've been doing DevOps, if you like, now for, I guess, nearly a decade, starting off with deployment automation. And this is one of the commonest questions and pieces of work that I do with my clients is things like metrics workshops and these discussions about how to get the right measurements and how to use them properly. So it is tough. And I guess there's two different things we're talking about, really. One is kind of measuring the impact that a DevOps evolution is happening. So knowing that improvement is occurring in an organization. And then the other part of this really is how a team can use measurements in order to inspect and adapt their own work. So there's kind of the two elements there, and they're very closely linked to the cultural questions as well. So, DevOps being a bottom-up, top-down movement, how leadership changes. So a lot of the time, the people that are asking for the measurements are initially the leadership, so the people that are in charge of the strategy and the direction of the company. But what's interesting about that is that actually, culturally, what we're trying to do in DevOps is distribute authority. We're trying to empower the teams. We're trying to ask leadership to change the way that they work and be less managers, less command and control, and more coaches that are encouraging the teams to discover improvements and make improvements themselves. So if we're trying to measure the impact that embracing DevOps ways of working is having on an organization, what we're ultimately looking for is the improvement of the way that value flows to our customer. So we want to accelerate the flow of value to the end user. So then the question becomes, well, what are the indicators that we might be doing that? And of course, we've got the huge body of work that is the State of DevOps reports, the Puppet Labs ones and the GCP or the Google Cloud Platform DORA Accelerate reports to look to for this. So at the very top level, we know that DevOps practices correlate with organizational performance and they correlate with technology delivery performance. So we can look to those reports. And then within that, we've got the four key metrics. So we've got our two throughput and our two stability metrics. Our two throughput metrics would be our deployment frequency and our lead time, and that's measured in DORA terms from the moment that we commit code to the point that becomes available in production. And then we've got our stability metrics as well, which are our change fail rate and our MTTR, mean time to recovery or resolution. And those four metrics give us a basis for measuring and looking at organisation performance. We know that elite performers are really good at those four metrics, and we know that links to organisation performance. What those metrics don't really show us, though, is flow, and that becomes quite interesting at that point. Yeah.
And you bring up flow. Is the reason that we can't measure that as much as it's a little different, or is it hard to measure? Why is that? I mean, I know that's important, and we talk a lot about that in DevOps and in the Kanban work.
It's really complex to measure flow because what we're doing effectively is measuring a whole value stream end to end. So we're measuring from the point somebody has an idea all the way through to the point that value is realized in a customer's hands. And in order to do that, we have to get everybody involved and all of the systems involved from the end-to-end value stream. So you mentioned Kanban as another lean tool, value stream mapping, which is the starting point for measuring this flow or cycle time. So it does get complicated because I mentioned lead time in the context of the DORA reports a moment ago. If I'm considering cycle time in the context of value stream mapping, what I'm talking about is the end-to-end cycle of the value stream from idea to realization. And in order to get to that number, you have to do things like perform a value stream mapping exercise, which means you have to get a group of people in a room for a couple of days normally, and visually collaborate, usually on a board with post-it notes, and get the humans to work together to analyse exactly what happens to that idea as it goes through the various processes and steps in that particular organisation. And that's a very human-oriented activity. So,
Yeah.
is it opinion-based or is it data-based in that environment?
I'm guessing where you come in a lot of organizations, like you mentioned, to do that human activity, you probably have to do a lot of questions to kind of discern whether it is, fact or opinion, and kind of how to, kind of scratch the surface and get to the truth there.
It's such a hugely valuable piece of work to do. You get a group of people in a room. They're often people that have not been in a room together before. They're quite, in traditional enterprises where we've got lots of silos, people are very spread out across the organisation. They often don't understand how their work is connected to someone else's work downstream. So you see a lot of light bulbs come on in the room. It takes a day at least to just map the current value stream. And when we're doing that, we're talking about getting the group of people to agree what the steps are end to end. Then we're getting them to agree how much touch time or how much actual activity and work is happening in each step, applying wait time between each step. So discussing with each other, what happens between a change approval board meeting and getting approval on that item, and then it coming back to the team that can then continue working on it, all those sort of questions.
Yeah.
Then we have discussions about what constitutes a value-adding activity, which is always a very interesting one, and people always ask you, how do you define a value-adding activity? And I kind of try and, obviously, traditional coaching skills, push it back at them to answer, but basically we're talking about something that is happening that is actually creating actual value that can be realised by the customer. So, for example, a change approval board would not be a value-adding activity, but a development activity would absolutely be creating value. You get very interesting conversations around testing, for example. So does testing create actual value for the customer? Perhaps not, but it's so important that we normally do a dotted line around it. Then in the value stream mapping activity, we'll also add metrics around things like how many full-time employees are involved, what percentage of their time is involved in that elapsed touch time, how much rework happens. And that allows us to start getting some costs associated with it. So we've built some calculators where you can put in a kind of nominal hourly rate, and then from that you can track what the cost looks like. But back to the original part of your question, yes, the conversations that happen in the room when you're doing this are just, mind-altering often, and people really starting to understand, getting that deep understanding of the system that we're, that Eric in the Phoenix Project encourages everyone to have. It's a very powerful way to unpick that. I was just doing some work actually documenting the steps on value stream mapping, and one of the tips I put in there was how a Muppet can help you with your value stream mapping. In fact, it's this Muppet here. So this is Elmo, and we use Elmo a lot because it stands for enough, let's move on. So we provide people with these little cards, a range of 4 cards, so people can hold them up. I think it's partly because I'm British and we have that reserve where we try and be polite. So it's kind of like it's a nice, light-hearted way to encourage the discussion to move when it needs to.
When somebody gets a little too deep.
Exactly. I call it going down the rabbit hole. And, another thing with value stream mapping is we normally do it across 2 days. And the first day is the current value stream, and the second day is the future value stream. But it's a tendency for lots of humans to try and solutionize too early. So it's kind of another time we often end up kind of Elmo carding is you're looking to the future, stay in the current.
I have to say that is the first time in the DevOps Online Summit that somebody's used a Muppet. So I think, we should mark this momentous occasion.
Excellent. Proud to be that person.
That's great. That's great. So as you talk about things like value stream mapping, and then coming back to, as you mentioned, as we're, trying to measure that value at that point, or is it some maybe later down the road as you're trying to collect those metrics and kind of baseline? Because as you starting that, a DevOps transformation, where is it at that point, or where do you start to get that baseline of metrics?
I always want people to do it right at the start when I meet them. The challenge then becomes what to do with the value stream maps that you've created, and this is one of the things that we continue to work with and not struggle with, but it's a definite area of improvement we're constantly working on at Range 4 with our clients, because what tends to happen is we do a value stream map. You get all these amazing people dedicating 2 days of their time to get in the room. You get all this incredible thinking and collaboration done, and you visualize all this work, and you get these huge insights, and you create this wonderful new value stream map of what the future is going to look like. And you've got you've got the demand coming straight into the product owner, and you've got refinement happening. You've shortened that cycle time because you're going into sprints, and you've automated, or you're testing. All these wonderful things have happened in the future value stream map. And then everyone disperses and goes back to their desks, and it's hard to get stuff happening. And one of the outputs of the value stream mapping exercise is the evolution backlog, which we try and encourage people to write as experiments. So it's a hypothesis backlog. It gets quite complicated about where those backlog items sit, particularly when the teams are not a nice, simple, ideal state of autonomous teams, but people are dissociated, and some people are using backlogs more effectively than other backlogs. So it's quite complex, that part. But the ongoing measurement is the really, really key part. And this is where I want to introduce another concept, which is value stream management. So easily confused, value stream mapping and value stream management. But value stream management is really the processes and the tools that go around that ongoing work. So whilst we've established during this conversation that value stream mapping is a hugely helpful way of people getting deep understanding of the system, building relationships with each other, understanding the ways of working that they need to change and the things that they need to do in order to make those organisational improvements, the ongoing inspection of those metrics is hard. Now, go back again, you asked, why is it hard? And I said it's the complexity of the processes and organisation and the tools. And this is the other important part about value stream management. We've reached a point in this industry where a CI/CD pipeline is quite a common thing now. It's observed in many organisations. But what we haven't yet nailed is how to integrate across a whole end-to-end DevOps tool chain, including things like our service desk and our monitoring and observability, to a point where we can inspect flow automatically. And this is what value stream management does allow us to do. So it's more than just a dashboard or a skin on top of our tools. It will actually talk to Jira and Jenkins and ServiceNow, for example, and allow us to look at the flow metric through the whole tool.
Interesting.
And this is really important, because then when the leadership say, and how are our teams improving, what impact is the DevOps work happening, we don't just go, well, we created a future value stream map and it looks a bit like this. We actually can inspect the system and say, this team had a deployment frequency of X, and that's reduced. That one's easy. We could probably do that in Jenkins or Rub Code, or maybe even in Jira if they're using tickets for that. But then we can also say, and the flow has improved. We can see that the cycle time has gone down from 98 days to 43, whatever it is.
So we can use like deployment frequency and cycle time as kind of a proxy for that flow, right?
Cycle time is the flow, I would argue. So this difference between lead time and cycle time. So lead time being from code commit to production, cycle time being from idea to value realization. And that is hard to measure in systems, even using value stream management, because quite often the idea is floating around for a while before it hits something like Jira. And this is why the discipline about product ownership and product backlogs is so important, so that we can really measure that from the start.
Now, you brought up something early, and I think I don't want to overlook this, but you talked about leadership and how kind of like the team and leadership and how they look at these value metrics a little bit differently. Talk to us about, as your work and you are consulting with companies, how maybe those metrics, you as a consultant maybe have to help leadership and teams and how to look at those metrics. And maybe I'm sure there's maybe some times where you see them use metrics and you kind of cringe or make sure that they're using them properly. I guess, what types of things do you have to kind of coach teams and leadership on using these metrics properly?
Oh, I can tell you some stories. I'll tell you one. So I had an instance with one of my clients where they gave an OKR to a team, which was deployment frequency. Now, we all know this is one of the 4 key metrics outdoor.
Yeah.
Good metric, right? What happened, though, is that they had co-located the developers and the testers. So classic first move to creating our autonomous multifunctional team. So that was good. Unfortunately, they didn't kind of give them a balancing OKR. So what happened was the developers decided to exclude the testers from the process because it was going to slow down their deployment frequency. So they ended up kind of this incredibly creative parallel sprinting kind of activity to basically just kind of spoof that metric. So what that told us is that culturally there was a real problem because the team were not using that metric to drive their improvement. What they were using it to do was to try and promote their performance to the leadership. So the leadership were acting in the wrong way and asking the wrong questions.
Yes.
And that's quite an extreme example. I've only really seen that happen that badly once, but it is a really good example of that the underlying cultural problem around this. And the whole world is in transition between these ways of working, and many of us have worked and have been used to working in environments where we report to a line manager who tells us what to do. And we may feel that we have some autonomy, but we're used to being told what to do. We're not used to going, I'm going to measure my progress in this way. And that's ultimately what we're asking teams to do when we empower them. But it doesn't often occur to people that that's their right. They're waiting for someone else to tell them what it is that they should do.
So what do you do, Helen? You have kind of a misalignment of that value that maybe stems from that cultural, maybe a leadership level. What are some things you do as a coach to help organizations understand how to maybe shift?
So we have a whole DevOps leader course, which we do use a lot, and it's intended for people leading DevOps change. So that helps. It's full of tools that help people understand culture and do stakeholder mapping and write business cases and do all that sort of stuff. So that's really useful for that type of leader. The problem with that is that type of leader has already got the light bulb on. So they've already kind of realised what they need to do, and they're excited about it and passionate about it, and they've got enthusiasm, and they're getting themselves, or they're already in a place where they can influence people around them. Then we've got the other type of leader that has the light bulbs haven't come on yet. So we need to figure out how to do that. And I just mentioned the stakeholder map, and that's something we use with our clients, with the DevOps leaders in our clients a lot, to try and work out how to get to the other leaders. So we look at whether a person is a critic or a cynic, or we look at their level of emotional engagement and their level of understanding, and we talk about what we need to do with them. One of the most effective ways we have found of getting senior leadership and execs on board and thinking in this way is actually to do experiential learning with them. So we've got a whole portfolio, but one of our favourite ones is a very new one that we have, which is called Digital Transformation Experience. And basically the people play roles in an airline. So they are doing the job of getting work out, so creating value for their clients, and it's real time. So there's a screen up that's showing how the organization is performing, and everyone in the room is doing something like managing incidents or coding or testing, and trying to create this flow of work. And that's a really effective way of getting the leaders to understand these ways of working and getting to them to understand the importance of having autonomous teams. And once people understand that teams need to be autonomous, leaders then start to understand why they need to distribute authority and why they need to empower those teams.
What are some steps, I guess, especially like when you're talking about autonomous teams and they can decide the values that they use to measure that value? How do you deal with maybe some execs that, because I've seen a lot of, especially as they're moving from like a command and control to trying to empower teams, that can be hard for them to kind of relinquish, as you mentioned, that authority?
It's hugely hard. Years ago, probably 4 years ago, I think it was, maybe even 5, at the first DevOps Enterprise Summit in London, I did a talk with Soren Pedersen, who at the time was working at one of our clients, Lego.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the correlations between DevOps and something called holacracy. Holacracy, I think you know about, but if people haven't heard of it before, it's effectively an agile organizational management system, and it has very common components in it to things that we want in DevOps, hence the talk. Many of you will know that Lego is based in Denmark, so Soren is Danish.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk quite a lot about holacracy, and holacracy is one of its kind of underlying fundamental principles is that the CEO must relinquish their power across the organization. And one of the things that Soren and I discussed was that actually holacracy was likely, we felt, to be more successful in the Danish and Nordic markets than the UK, because they naturally have much flatter hierarchies in their companies in that region than we do in the UK. We have hugely complex ones in the UK, and I think this harks back to the way that we school people in our country. So we have a split system where you either go to the state-funded school or your parents pay for you to go to a private school. It's confusingly, we call them public schools, but God knows why. But anyway, as you can imagine, if people have extra money to pay for their children to go to school, it's a better level of education. It leads to what we call an old boys network. And what I'm getting to is a lot of people that have been through that schooling system are likely to be the people that get the most prestigious positions in their markets, so the CEO roles. Now, what these schooling systems do is they teach people early on that we want power and we want status, and the way that we get that is to have control over people, and that kind of feeling I don't think goes away. So this relinquishing of power is really hard for humans when they measure their own status, and their neurological happiness is dictated by the amount of reports they've got, for example. So and this ripples down an organization, right? So I gave the example of the developers and testers moving together into a team earlier on. And this is hard, for example, if you're a testing manager and you've got 50 testers that report into you and you feel good about that. And then someone says, well, we need to embed testers in every team. And you're like, but what about all my direct reports that I have? So it's a human thing. It is a neurological thing, and it is hard to do for sure.
It's a big change.
It is a big change. And I do think that it's something that won't happen overnight, because not all humans are ready to work in this different way. But I do think that as time ticks on and people move on, this will increase as we move forward, for sure.
Yeah, I was just in a conversation just the other day about kind of the project manager, scrum master dynamics. And that came up, just that, if we change your role, and just, I think it gets back to that fundamental human change can be difficult. It can feel like a challenge, a threat. And that's where, like you mentioned, is these leaders, they've gotten to a certain place in their career and they don't want to relinquish that power.
Absolutely. And, this resistance to change is a neurological thing. I'm a bit of a hobbyist neuroscientist. And one of the books that I've been reading is Brett Andreatta's book, Wired to Resist. And in that, she explains that we are literally wired to resist. It is in our lizard brain. It's right back in the amygdala, the kind of the part of our brain that was the first part that evolved eons ago. And it makes sense, right? So if you're wandering through the bush looking for some food, and that shrub looks different from what it looked like yesterday because there's a lion behind it, it makes sense. So we have kind of we have a fear response, which is an avoidance response, but we also have an approach response, which is a novelty response normally. So what we need to do to help people is help them understand that there is an opportunity for them. So of course, if you're a project manager that's highly trained in Prince2 and you've been operating that way in 20 years, suddenly being told that we're moving from project to product and we need project managers anymore, it's going to be Terrifying.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, how am I going to feed my family and pay my mortgage if I don't have a job? So rather than talking about that, we need to show them stories like the PMO is dead, long live the PMO, which was a talk that Barclays did a couple of years ago at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, that explained exactly what does happen to project management in this new world, that they become enabled and empowered to you know, really help the teams do things like, you know, limit the WIP, make connections between what the CEO wants and what a developer is doing, and make those connections obvious and real and helpful to people.
Yeah. Very interesting. So coming back to value, what type of tools can we use to, you know, to measure that value in a DevOps system?
So this is kind of going back a little bit to the conversation we had earlier about the progression of a CI/CD pipeline and the DevOps toolchain. So if we talk through what that looks like, I like to use something that I call IVA, which I call the DevOps loop or the value loop. And IVA stands for ideation, integration, validation, operation, and realization. And I draw it as a circle of the 5 components. And I came up with that because I was talking at an event several years ago now, and I put up a kind of standard table of an SDLC on it and blocked one bit out as kind of dev activities and one bit out as ops activities. And someone quite rightly in the audience said, it's, you know, it's not very continuous, it doesn't look very DevOps, it looks kind of siloed. And you know, then the infinity loop came out as well, and I'm not a huge fan of the DevOps infinity loop because it's got dev on one side and ops on the other. So again, we've got this problem that we've still got these silos. So what I tried to do is break it down and make it as simple as possible. And I use it to, when I'm assessing companies' capability, I use it to look at processes, and I also use it to look at the tool chain as well. So, and look at the maturity and capability within the tool chain. So, if we look at it that way and think about what tools people have got, from an ideation perspective, most people have got a backlog, and for most people that means Jira. For some people, it might mean Azure DevOps. Some people might have some AHA or Asana and stuff sitting around that, but generally it's going to be Jira. And Jira is obviously extraordinarily powerful, which is why lots of people use it. And can be used to give us things like the deployment frequency. Some of my customers do use it to they have ticket types and ticket statuses that enable us to get that sort of metric out of them. Then at the integration piece, and I use the word integration rather than development or build because I think that most people are composing code now rather than encoding code. So, you know, we've got huge artifact repositories out there like Maven and Nexus and things like that where people can get code from. And then we're using things like usually Jenkins, Circle CI, Bamboo, Azure DevOps. Something is our CI server that is doing our, the developer is enabled to commit code at least daily and run a number of automated tests, hopefully unit integration and user acceptance. Not always the case, but, you know, let's talk about the more capable models and we'll say they're doing that. So then we've got our validation that's happening at that point. So we've got our testing tools, and I've mentioned 3 types of tests there: unit integration and user acceptance. I haven't mentioned security testing, but we would want to see that happening there or in the IDE as well. So you're starting to build up this pattern. Then we've got our operations piece. We've got our service desk, which for most people is ServiceNow or similar or Cherwell or maybe Jira Service Desk. And then we've got our R word, which is realization. So we've got our observability monitoring tools there. So things like Splunk, AppDynamics, New Relic, Dynatrace, all of that kind of stuff. So you can see how the tool chain builds up, and we see that when we get realization, we then want that to flow into the idea. So that's our feedback loop, right? That's where we're being told that whether our feature did what we wanted it to do, and we want now to Jira and our backlog to be influenced by what we learned about what happened. So that's all cool, and you can integrate all of those pieces in the DevOps loop or the DevOps toolchain yourself. Of course you can. You could hard code it. It's going to take you ages. It's going to be a nightmare to change anything in the future. You can use APIs better, save some time. Does get you into like a little bit of lock-in. It is a little bit more difficult to pull things in and out. So most organizations' tool chains evolve over time. they will, as an organisation, a large enterprise in particular, evolves using these ways of working, they will probably find they've got some teams using one tool and some teams using another tool. So one of my clients just made a decision to go with GitLab over Jenkins, for example. It took them a year to come to that decision, because reaching consensus with the humans that had emotions about their tool, it made it really difficult. But now some people are going to have to pull one tool out and put another tool in.
Yeah.
So you can, APIs good, but still lock in. There are kind of broker tools that you can get out there, which are helpful, but all they're doing is really connecting it and giving you some traceability through it. There are dashboards available as well. So lots of my clients look to Capital One's open source Hygeia for this. So dashboard is useful, but it is effectively just a skin on top of your tool chain. So you're just looking into the points. You're not looking at the flow between the tools. And this is, remember, the most important metric is the cycle time and the flow from start to finish. You know, we want to get that down from 93 days to 42 to 2. We want to make that as quick as possible. So in terms of the tools you want to use there, this is where we get into the value stream management tool category. So Forrester put out a report in late 2018 about this category. The leaders in the space are Plutora and TaskTop in particular. So those are the tools that people would look to if they are ready. And I would encourage people to look at those tools the minute they think they want to go on these journeys, because if they don't, what they will find happening is several months down the line, the leaders will be saying, show me the improvement. And they won't have the data to hand because they haven't put these tools in place.
Yeah, that measurability is so important, and to automate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to spend any extra time looking at systems and reporting on systems and making PowerPoints to show your management. It literally needs to be immediate and accurately real time. Yeah.
So how do we look at measuring the business value versus the customer value?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one, isn't it? So I did a whole webcast on value a little while ago. So arguably they're the same thing in many ways, right? I mean, if the business value is revenue and profit, then the customer enjoying something and wanting to use something more and therefore buying more of it is kind of the same thing. I think what gets very interesting about this, though, is when we talk about this project to product stuff and what needs to happen from a funding model, from a business perspective. So the business, we tend to use that word, the business, as though they're somehow separate from the technology teams. And I think we all understand how we've got here. You know, IT didn't used to be a thing. We didn't used to have computers, and then organisations started using it, and then they started investing more and more in it, and then started realising they were spending a lot of money on it. So they siloed the technology teams and treated them as a cost centre, treated them as order takers. All of that stuff happened. Fast forward to today, when you know, it's a global, software has eaten the world. It's a global internet marketplace. Businesses are being put out of business daily because they're being disrupted by new models that use these technologies. And technology is no longer separate from the business. It is the business. So this is why we have conversations about whether companies are technology companies or not. So it is all about the customer value. And when we move to product, what we really want to do is capacity fund our teams. So we don't want us to be driven by the business deciding they're going to do a project and the order takers in IT are going to do it. That model has to change, and the model has to change to a place where the product teams are end to end, responsible for the delivery of that value to the customer, and they can measure it. What's happened to me very recently with one of my clients is I observed a conversation where a particular person said, we're never going to get hold of the P&L. We're never going to be able to move away from project-led funding. We're never going to have control over that. And then literally half an hour later, as the conversation progressed, he went, but we already have the P&L data. He suddenly realised that as we move to product-centric teams, we know what the cost of the team is. That is capacity funded. And now, if we can measure the value, we have the cost to value ratio of the team. That is the P&L, which is a
light bulb moment.
Lights on moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very exciting. Yeah.
It's interesting. You can do that in 30 minutes, Helen. You work magic.
He was very insightful already. He'd been at the organisation a long time. So I think his first reaction was based on kind of previous experience, and then kind of the realisation of what they've managed to do in the last 12 months just kind of like hit home.
Boom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Helen, you've really shared a lot with us. Any closing thoughts?
I'm really excited about this space. I'm hoping to put some research out there quite soon to try and get more data from the market about what businesses are actually doing today in terms of measuring value. So, kind of back to that last question, what is value to one organization? Do we measure it by NPS scores? Do we measure it by revenue? Do we measure it by profit? How do we measure it at a user story or a feature level into Jira? How do we measure it? That's trickier than measuring a release, isn't it? Particularly if we're doing sprint-based releases, we can kind of go, well, we know we put a big chunk of things out in 2 weeks, so we can see if our policy conversion rate on our website was impacted by that.
Yeah.
People that are listening, please look out for that research report. I hope it will be, the survey will be out sometime soon-ish, and let's all get to a point where everybody can measure their flow of their value and optimize that to their customers' hands.
Excellent. Thanks for coming on, Helen.
Thanks very much for having me.
We hope you are enjoying the DevOps Online Summit. To gain lifetime access to this great content, make sure you upgrade for VIP tickets. On behalf of Helen Beal, I am Tom Hendrickson from the DevOps Online Summit.